Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Basketball Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, Nelson, here on this Friday afternoon, and we have a couple of things to talk about basketball. Obviously, the biggest news in the sports world right now is, focusing more on the football games that, specifically the football game that happened yesterday, and there's going to be another one today. So if you guys are interested in football as well as basketball, then we also have we have different other podcasts as well. We have football podcasts. We have two different football podcasts, I believe, a fantasy football podcast, and then a sports podcast that also covers football. TJ, Manny, Chris, and Kenneth, they all do a great job. So I recommend watching those guys if you guys are interested in learning about football. But here we have basketball. And for the first segment, I'm going to talk about the biggest questions for the Southeastern Division and the teams. And then in the second segment, since I mentioned how Brandon Ingram is most likely going to be on a different team after this season, we are going to go ahead and look at the possible landing spots where Brandon Ingram could end up being, like the possible teams that are either interested in him or could acquire him or could get some use out of him. And then in the third segment, we are going to talk about how James Worthy feels about Kevin Durant being in the GOAT conversation. James Worthy is all for Kevin Durant being in the GOAT conversation. So we're just going to talk a little bit about that and my opinions on that. And then in the fourth segment, we are going to talk about the importance of depth, because now we're starting to, with the new luxury tax and the second apron and the new CBA rules that the NBA have to follow, now we're going to see a lot more teams prioritize depth as opposed to star power. So I'm just going to go over the importance of that and just where do you draw that line between star power and depth. And then in the fifth segment, like I've been doing in the previous fifth segments, I'm going to be talking about a player who I feel like didn't deserve to win the MVP in a specific year, and I'm going to reveal who that player is at the end of the fourth segment, so be sure to stay tuned for that. Before I begin, however, I do like to remind everybody that we love to hear what you guys have to say during the show. Whether you have a burning question, hot take for the game, something you've been dying to share, we're all ears. The show is all about keeping the conversation lively, making sure your voice is a part of the mix. Don't be shy to drop your thoughts in the chat. If you really want to make sure that your comment or question gets noticed, then you can go ahead and hit Super Chat. You just click on the $sign below the chat box, send in your message. It's guaranteed to get featured on the show. It's a great way to support the channel. If Super Chat isn't really your thing, then you can always go ahead and use the link displayed below the ticker or just in the description, gsmcpodcast.net, and send in your comment or question that way. It really helps the show, makes it much more interactive between myself and you guys. And without further ado, let's go right ahead and get into the first segment, which is about the Southeastern Division and the Southeastern Division teams. Now, obviously, a lot of these teams, there's going to be a lot of questions surrounding these teams. Now, some teams are going to have bigger questions than others. Some teams might actually have more than one big question than the other. But we're going to go over all of those teams. First team we're going to talk about is the Atlanta Hawks. Now, the Hawks, they recently traded away DeJounte Murray over to the Pelicans, and what they got in return was a little bit underwhelming. Like, I would have expected the Hawks to at least try to include Brandon Ingram in the trade package if they were going to send DeJounte over to New Orleans, but they didn't. And because they didn't include him in that trade package, they got rather mediocre players in return and a mediocre pick in return. And that's just the thing. Like, you're trading away DeJounte Murray, who's way above the skill level of a mediocre player, for mediocrity. Like, that doesn't help your team at all. Then again, it's not like DeJounte was really helping the team all that much either. The Trae Young and DeJounte Murray experiment, I should say, excuse me. So now the big question going forward is the era of Trae Young on the Hawks going to come to a close? Given how Trae Young, he wants to win. He's a competitor, and he said it several times. He said it on podcasts. He said it on interviews. He always wants to win. He would love to win in Atlanta, but if he can't win in Atlanta, he would consider opening his options to other teams and playing for other teams. Now, that's obviously, if you're a Hawks fan, that's a little bit concerning because Trae Young is arguably it's the star player of your team, and you definitely need him if you want to compete for a title. Now, whether he's good enough to be a first option, I'm not entirely sure. I think a second option on a team is definitely like his role for him, even though he could totally like play the first option. It's just, I think it would be much better off if he was a second option on a team, and similar to how Damian Lillard would be a second option to Giannis Antetokounmpo, like something like that. And really, like, they got rid of the whole experiment with Murray, so it shows that they're committed to Trae Young. But it's, if they can't acquire the good enough pieces to convince Trae Young to stay on the Hawks, then it might be over for them. And I mean, the Hawks, they've been, ever since that one sort of finals, Eastern Conference Finals appearance that they got to in 2021, they have never really come close to that same level of success in the postseason. And that's if you're Trae Young, obviously that's going to be rather frustrating because you are constantly putting up these 25 plus, 10 plus stat lines, 25 plus points, 10 plus assist stat lines, and your team is still stuck in mediocrity. Now, what are the teams that Trae Young might actually consider going to? Not entirely sure. That's a completely different conversation. But if the Hawks overachieved this year, this question is probably going to get pushed further down the line. But if the losses start to pile up early and quickly for the Hawks, then the focus might shift towards developing the young core as opposed to settling with Trae Young. So this could either push, the fact that the Hawks would want to center on their young core, this might push Trae Young away, who is right now trying to, be in a competing spot for a title, since all of his peers are now in a competing spot for a title. Well, most of his peers. Now, next team on this list is the Charlotte Hornets. They are another team in the in the Southeastern Division, and we have to figure out exactly if Melo can even stay healthy. That's really the big question for this team, and for a lot of, because LaMelo was drafted number 3 overall. He was a great player. Like, when he plays, he's phenomenal. Some people might even argue that his offensive game is better than his brother Lonzo's, who's been in the NBA for a pretty long time. But a common trait about both of those players, Lonzo and LaMelo, is that they both get injured a lot. Like, it's a very, very common thing for them to get injured, and that's going to be the biggest question for Charlotte, because in my opinion, if Charlotte continues to have, if Charlotte has the same young core that they have paired up with LaMelo, and if they're able to develop LaMelo without having to constantly worry about his injuries, I feel like they could be a really good and a really competitive team in the NBA. Again, this is all just dependent on if Melo is healthy. Melo has barely been able to be healthy. Same thing applies with his brother. Like, they're just so unhealthy in every single season. And he hasn't even eclipsed 60-plus games played in the last 2 years. But when he played 75 games his sophomore season, the Hornets made the play-in round and were on the verge of capturing the East's final playoff spot. So when they have LaMelo, they're a very not a very good team, but a decent team, and a team that could show you some flashes of excellence. But without Melo, then they're just unable to do that. And I really think that that's going to be their big question. Next team on the list, and we are a little bit short on time, so I might speed it up just a bit. Next team on this list is the Miami Heat. And the biggest question that's been going on for the entirety of the offseason, if you guys have been paying attention to the podcast, is if Jimmy Butler is either going to get traded or if Jimmy Butler is going to leave. Like, Actually, wait, no. We know Jimmy Butler is planning on going into free agency. The question is if Jimmy Butler is going to get traded, because everyone knows that Jimmy's probably going to try to be a free agent. But Miami, knowing that, they're not going to want to just, let him walk. They're going to try and secure assets for themselves so that way they can use those assets to thus make the roster a bit better and maybe get something out of letting Jimmy Butler walk. And obviously they don't want to make the same mistake of the Clippers where they just let Paul George walk without any issue. And I think that's sort of like where the question of is Jimmy Butler going to get traded comes from. So next team on this list is the Orlando Magic. Orlando Magic. So the big question for Orlando is, will they have enough three-point shooting? That was a thing that sort of that I've been critiquing them about. Like, their three-point shooting, some of the players on their squad aren't really consistent three-point shooters, and when you don't have consistent three-point shooters in this league, it makes it all that much more difficult to win a game. So they really needed to. I think Franz Wagner is going to be a very, very solid shooter for the Orlando Magic, and KCP also. They acquired KCP in free agency. He's another very good shooter. So now we're just going to have to. Now the Magic just have to sort of put this into practice and see if they legitimately can be a solid three-point shooting team. And finally, the worst team, arguably the worst team in the NBA right now, the Washington Wizards, or the worst team in the NBA last season. Again, arguably. And the biggest question that they have for this season is this season going to be as bad as last season? Yes, that is the question that we got for them. Because, to be fair, that last season was awful. Everybody thought that Jordan Poole was going to be just this phenomenal player on a bum team. Like, they thought he was going to drop, and I say bum team because it's a non-competing team. That's sort of what you call those teams when they're not in a spot to compete. They're bottom-feeding teams. So the Jordan Poole, he was traded, not traded over. He signed with a bottom-feeding team, and usually the expectation is when a good player signs with a team that has little expectations, that good player is going to just go off and play phenomenally. Everybody thought that before the Washington Wizards season started that Jordan Poole was going to average 28 or 29 or 30 on 20 shot attempts. Everybody thought that he was going to be some sort of fantastic offensive talent, and that ultimately amounted to nothing. And that rolled over into the rest of the Washington Wizards and the roster because Jordan Poole plays with a sort of I don't really care attitude. And that's sort of what I see from him, and that's sort of what I see from a lot of the other players on Washington. It feels like they play for themselves as opposed to playing for the win. And obviously when you play for yourself, you're just never, ever, ever going to win in the NBA. So that's all I have for this first segment. So now I will go ahead and go into the second segment where I talk about potential landing spots for Brandon Ingram right after this short break. So be sure to stay tuned.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. everybody in the world blind?
And we are back with the second segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this second segment, I'm going to be talking about some potential landing spots for Brandon Ingram, since I believe he is one of the players and probably the most likely player who's not going to play for his team next season. Not this coming season, because he's going to play for the Pelicans, obviously, but I feel like next season he's going to leave and he's going to try to find a different team. So now we're just going to go over some of the teams that have a chance of either acquiring him or some teams that might have a really good fit for him. So before I begin, however, I do like to remind everybody that we all love to hear, we all love to hear exactly what you guys have to say during the show, whether you guys have a hot take or a burning question or something that you've been dying to say. We're all ears. And if you really want your comment or question to get noticed, just go ahead and use Super Chat. You can click the $ below the chat box, and you can send in your comment or donation that way. It really helps the show, makes it much more interactive. And if you don't like using Super Chat, if that's not your thing, you can always use the link displayed below the ticker or the link in the description, gsmcpodcast.net, and donate or send in your comments that way. Really helps the show, makes it much more interactive between myself and you guys. And without further ado, let's go ahead and continue on with the second segment, where we talk about Brandon Ingram and some potential destinations that he could end up in. So one team that I feel like could acquire Brandon Ingram is the Miami Heat. We were just talking about the Miami Heat. We were talking about how Jimmy Butler has there's a chance, there's a question bubbling around whether or not Jimmy's going to get traded. There's also the thought that Jimmy Butler is just not going to be a Miami Heat anymore after this season. And the Heat are going to be in search of another small forward to try and sort of fill in that role that Jimmy Butler had on the team, whether it be the role of a leader, whether it be the role of a scorer, something. They're going to try to fill in that role after Jimmy leaves. So even if Butler remains on Miami beyond the summer of 2025, it's probably fair to expect the face of the franchise to soon pass someone else, presumably to Bam Adebayo. So Butler is going to turn 36 at the start of the 2025 to 2026 season, and all of that really suggests the Heat could be in the market for a new small forward, because why would you want to continue having a small forward that is that old? Unless his name is LeBron, I don't know why you'd want to have a small forward that's 36 years old. But aside from that, I mean, not saying that Jimmy Butler wouldn't be good as a 36-year-old. However, it is like not everyone in the NBA is going to be able to keep the same amount of consistency for as long as LeBron was able to do, because we're not entirely sure if Jimmy Butler's even going to be the same player that he was either going into this season or going into the next season, especially since he came off of an injury. So, of course, Ingram isn't really on track to be the next Jimmy Butler. Like, there's no real hype around him for that. But there's Miami could reasonably talk itself into Jacquez Jr. and Tyler Hero replacing their current superstar. So, while I don't think that it'll be that as impactful as having Jimmy on Miami, I do think that Miami is a pretty good spot for Brandon Ingram, and a spot that he should consider. Another spot that Brandon Ingram should also consider playing for is the Cleveland Cavaliers. So the idea that Ingram joins Cleveland seems like it was like a huge rumor that was going to happen, because Jake Fisher reported on Yahoo Sports that Cleveland held extreme interest in Ingram, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised if depending on how the season goes, Cleveland decides to move along some of their players to make space for Brandon Ingram. So Cleveland has two redundancies within its starting five. Donovan Mitchell, Darius Garland should probably both be lead playmakers, but they're also both small. So playing them together makes defense a lot more difficult, and you can turn the offense into something more of a your turn, my turn thing. Then on the other side of the lineup, the Cavs are essentially starting two centers, barring some of the rapid and dramatic development of Evan Mobley's jumper, which has been improving. Playing him alongside Jarrett Allen can lead to a cramped offensive system with slightly less positional versatility on the other end. Essentially, you're going to mess up your spacing with that. And a trade involving the former pairing, barring New Orleans' inclusion of players other than Ingram, probably doesn't make much sense. The Pelicans already have DeJounte and CJ McCollum and a bunch of wings to cram into their rotation. It'd be hard to find the right role for Garland there if they were to trade for either one of those guards. And Mitchell is honestly just way too good to be in this discussion. So if Ingram and Allen swapped, because honestly that might seem like a pretty decent move, because the Pelicans are in search of a center that can play defense, and Jarrett Allen would fit in that role pretty well. And if you put Ingram on that roster, then the scoring could definitely increase as opposed to having Jarrett Allen on the roster. And if you set aside Ingram's next contract for a moment, something that Cleveland doesn't really have the luxury tax to do, a far short-term deal that moves, it would bump Mobley to his more natural position at the 5 and would be able to create much better spacing for the rest of the guards like Donovan Mitchell and Garland if this lineup were to be paired up together. But that's just my opinion. Next team on this list is the San Antonio Spurs. Now, this is another situation where Ingram would probably arrive as a second or a third option behind Victor Wembanyama, and it's a little easier to find much more logical trades as well as reason to sign extensions with San Antonio. And they're good salary cap. They have good salary, and one of which is attached to a center for Harrison Barnes, Keldon Johnson, and Zach Collins, who would likely leapfrog Yves Mezzi and Daniel Theis on New Orleans. Since Victor Wembanyama is on his rookie deal and Devin Vassell signed for less than the max, San Antonio might be able to justify slightly overpaying Ingram for the next 2 or 3 years in order to get him onto the roster. Now, in terms of a fit, maybe it's not ideal with Ingram potentially taking some of the possessions away from Wemby, Vassell, or Chris Paul, but it would give the Spurs a consistent 20-point-per-game scorer, which would really take a lot of pressure off of somebody like Victor Wembanyama. And the last team that could be in the talks of acquiring Brandon Ingram is the Brooklyn Nets. Now, this might just be a little bit of optimism from me. Now, this might just be like a little bit of just, me hoping, but the Nets, they have a lot of picks. They can engage in a lot of trades. They can move a lot of players if they need to. And Nick Claxton is a quality starting center as well, something that New Orleans simply does not have right now. And he might actually be a good enough fit to get the Pelicans to attach some draft capital to Ingram to make this deal happen. So spacing should be an issue for a Claxton-Zion, front court, but a lineup with those two, Herb Jones, Trey Murphy, and DeJounte Murray, could really have defenses in shambles. Now, for Brooklyn's perspective, this would be about simply continuing the teardown that began by trading Mikal Bridges and reacquiring control of their own 2025 first-round pick. The Nets are in asset accumulation mode, so turning Claxton into a pick alone would be justifiable, and they wouldn't really have to talk themselves into extending or even re-signing Ingram. Having his expiring contract come off of the books next summer would give them more flexibility as they build around whoever comes along the next few drafts. So really, they're just trying to build. The idea would be to try to build for the future, and Ingram would be the number one option for that future. Adding Ingram alone isn't going to lead to a ton of wins, but if the Brooklyn Nets are able to acquire Cooper Flagg, who knows? But that's all that I have on this second segment. So now we will go ahead and go into the third segment where I talk about James Worthy and his opinions on Kevin Durant being in the GOAT conversation. So I'll be right back after this short break, so be sure to stay tuned.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
And we are back with the third segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this third segment, I'm going to be talking about Kevin Durant being in the GOAT conversation and how James Worthy feels about it. So I'm looking at it from this article, by the way. So I'm going to go over the article first, and then I'm just going to give my opinions on this article and what James Worthy had to say. So the article starts, usually a few players are debated as the greatest of all time. The most common players are Kareem, LeBron, MJ, and Kobe Bryant, and sprinkle in a little bit of other players, and the rest is other. Like, literally, that's how it goes. You either LeBron, Kareem, Jordan, Kobe, and the rest is other. And a lot of people, when they go into other, like Anthony Edwards, for example, they pick Kevin Durant. And given his continued dominance and elegant aging, is this statement really true? So the article continues saying, when asked if Kevin Durant's name should be mentioned in the discussion of the greatest player of all time, three-time NBA champion James Worthy enthusiastically agreed, saying, I do. I've loved him since Texas. If I'm choosing somebody, he might be. You know, Steph shoots the three, but Durant is cold-blooded at his height. And I think because there's so much attention on other players right now, he hasn't been forgotten about, but he's just been schmoozing along, and he still can put up numbers. He added, I just love his range, the way he can move out there to the three. You can't stop him in the mid-range game. He's a pretty good defensive player, and he doesn't get talked enough about. If you're talking like top 7 guys who can be the greatest of all time, he's in there in my opinion. He's just a phenomenal player. So Kevin Durant, the article continues going, Kevin Durant has a long list of achievements and is far from finished. In addition to being a 4-time Olympic gold winner, Kevin Durant is a 2-time NBA champion, 2-time Finals MVP, 14-time All-Star, and a regular season MVP. He is undoubtedly among the greatest in the league when you compare his resume to some others. So the article also continues saying why Kevin Durant's GOAT case is valid. So they claim that, well, not really they claim, but they say that he averaged 27 points, 7 rebounds, 4 assists, 1.1 steal, and 1.1 block through his 16-year career with the Thunder, the Warriors, the Nets, and Phoenix. He has also shot 50% from the field and 38% from 3. Durant has never finished a game with an average of less than 25 points, except in his rookie year when he averaged 20 points. Actually, no. The article misspoke. The article meant to say Durant never finished a season with an average of less than 25 points. I think that's what they meant to say. So Durant's 2 championships and Finals MVP honors with a team that finished 73-9 without him pale into the accomplishments of the 3 players at the top of the GOAT discussion. The fact that the Warriors won a championship before and after he arrived diminishes it. Thus, nobody will likely mention Durant as a worthy candidate for the GOAT. Last September will mark Durant's 36th birthday. He hasn't shown any symptoms of slowing down. If he and the Phoenix Suns are successful in their pursuit of the NBA championship, it would be his 3rd. And about that, honestly, the last part of that article where the article mentions the Finals MVPs and his success with Golden State as being a big reason why he's not in the GOAT conversation, that is 100% true. That is facts, and that should be taken into account when you're looking at a player's career. Context is everything, and a lot of people, when they look at a player and they look at a player's accolades and like their accomplishments and their achievements, they don't take into account context. They only look at either the raw numbers, the advanced stats, and nothing else that might have come into play throughout the entire NBA season. And a lot of people, not really, a lot of people, they don't like to mention that, or Kevin Durant defenders, they don't like to mention how Kevin Durant single-handedly ruined the NBA for about 3 years with arguably the weakest move in sports history by joining that 73-9 Warriors team. In my opinion, he should never be forgiven for joining the Warriors team, and he should never be forgotten about for joining the Warriors team. And if we are going to be without Golden State, Kevin Durant still has 0 NBA championships. So he has yet to win a real legit title without having like ridiculous help around him, despite being 14 plus seasons into the NBA. Tried to start a big 3 in Brooklyn. That failed due to injuries and Kyrie being a quack and his fat foot stepping on the 3-point line. And then he tried to form another one in Phoenix, and now this one is starting to look bad and starting to fail. And it doesn't make, it's like, how can you give this man like any sort of credit for being in the GOAT conversation? Like, yes, he still has 2 rings and 2 finals, and he still has 2 rings, 2 finals MVPs, but those 2 rings and 2 finals MVPs, they aren't nearly as impressive as any other team's rings and finals MVPs. Like, it's more of like a technicality kind of thing, you know? Like, actually, you know what? I'm not even going to say this. I'm not even going to say what I wanted to say, because that might bring up a lot of criticism on my end. But aside from that, I mean, Kevin Durant's finals MVPs, they aren't really considered legitimate due to just how easy the finals MVPs were. Like, yes, his production and his numbers, they were ridiculous and they were finals MVP worthy. But when you're on a roster like that, of course you're going to drop those numbers. And in my opinion, you cannot be that guy when you're playing with those guys. Like, does that make sense to all of you guys? Like, you simply cannot be that guy if you're playing with all of those guys. And Kevin Durant was only that guy when he was playing with all of those guys. Because if you take away his career, like his little tenure with Golden State, every single year has been riddled with playoff disappointments coming in from Kevin Durant. And he doesn't seem to have all that much success unless he's on a ridiculously stacked team. We give the same amount of criticism for LeBron playing on a stacked team, which his team wasn't nearly as stacked as this team, because the Warriors came 1 game away from sweeping the entire league. And this isn't in like the old days of the NBA. This is modern NBA. And they forced the league to catch up. That's how ridiculously good they were. If you watch them on the sideline and stuff, everybody knew that they were going to win. The players themselves knew that they were going to win. And it was just it was unfair. In fact, players now, they're sort of opening up to just sort of how unfair that roster actually was. And really, that's sort of, obviously, that's really my strong opinion on Kevin Durant. He had a chance to be in there. If maybe things turned out differently in Brooklyn, he did have a shot, but after that, I think, no. You can't really put him in the GOAT conversation after that. Unfortunate for all of you KD fans out there. But aside from that, we are out of time for this third segment. So now we will go ahead and go into the fourth segment, where I talk about the importance of depth. So I'll be right back after this short break. Be sure to stay tuned.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
And we are back with the fourth segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast, presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Excuse me. And in this fourth segment, I'm going to talk about the sort of importance of depth in the NBA, especially right now, sort of given the new CBA rules on the luxury tax and how much teams can afford to pay their players going into future NBA seasons. So this obviously was sort of inspired by, the Knicks and just how much depth their roster has, as well as the Boston Celtics and how much depth their roster has, and the fact that the Celtics were able to win the championship with that depth. This might be sort of like a trend-setting this might be a trend-setting thing that so many other teams are going to try and do, like acquire all of these competent players in the starting lineup, and to sort of have that depth. So we're just going to talk a little bit about that. And so the article, I also have an article pulled up here as well, just talking a little bit about depth and the importance of it. So different lineups and reevaluating the bench has been a huge theme over the past couple of weeks. And an angle that hasn't really been talked about yet is how much depth really matters. So the Knicks rotation has, to compensate the lack of how should I say this? Because I think Jalen Brunson is an A-list star, but a lot of people don't really consider him as, an A-list star. That's what the article is saying. Like, I believe A-list is like superstars, like that kind of stardom, like superstar players that can change the game. And I think Jalen Brunson is one of them, but it's not like, how should I say this? Well, I do think he is one of them in the league. He's not like one of those super, super big names, I guess you could say, that would attract as much attention as somebody like maybe Jokic, maybe LeBron, maybe somebody as big as Steph, maybe somebody like KD or Devin Booker, something like that. And so without having like that definite number one player on your team, you have to have sort of an abundance of role players, which is exactly what the Knicks have. So their depth is very impressive on paper. The Celtics showed that a version of this formula could work even at the highest level, and winning with a depth roster, is that going to be like the way forward? That's sort of like what I'm going to be talking about. I think that's going to be a trend. So, but I also think that there's like a yes it can, and there's also like a no aspect in part of it, because depth is very, very important for the regular season, right? However, when you're going into the postseason, you need that star power. Like, star power really matters in the postseason. So this is exactly why teams, like, they need that sort of star, and you can't sort of win a championship without one. And, like, that's why someone like having somebody like Nikola Jokic on your team means that your team is going to dominate whenever he's on the floor, and that just ultimately gives your team more confidence. And not only that, Jokic is one of the players that can actually meet the moments, in the big moments when you need him. He didn't do it in Game 7 this previous season, but you can't be perfect. Nobody is perfect. And the Celtics, they didn't have, like, that same level of player. Like, it's not the same level of player as someone like Jokic, who can change the game and alter the game and control the game the way that he does. But they do have a very, very competent starting lineup. And that's what leads to wins in the postseason when rotations are cut down. Their regular season starters with, Porzingis, had a really good net rating of plus 12. That success carried over into the postseason, even when they had to change Kristaps with Al Horford due to his injuries. And having dominant starters as a trend among the having dominant starters is a trend amongst the Celtics, and it's been a trend amongst, like, the last 5 Celtics championship teams. So each team's starters had a playoff net rating of 10 plus or better. That one exception was in 2020, the Los Angeles Lakers, who had a plus 5 net rating for their most used starting lineup. But the 5-man group they played most, with JaVale McGee in place of Dwight, registered a plus 17 net rating, and the starting lineup they used in Game 6 had a plus 44 net rating. Excuse me. So recent history has sort of showed that it's more important how your best and most used lineups fare in as opposed to the other team's best players. And that isn't to say that the Knicks model isn't going to work, right? Their starting lineup with Hartenstein and Anunoby was impressive last season, so there's reason to believe that they can make it work with Mitchell Robinson and Mikal Bridges. But is the strength of your starting group that makes the difference in the postseason? So this brings us around to the Cavs. Although there are concerns about the backup big man situation or overall depth, the Cavs will only be as successful as their starting lineup will take them. Last year's starters will likely be the preferred group again for this season. And, as I said before, they're only successful as their starters. Donovan Mitchell wasn't there when Cleveland was playing Boston, and because of that ultimately costed them their season. And on top of that, Darius Garland didn't really play well in the elimination game either. And Jarrett Allen's injury in the postseason as well meant that the starters, like, literally not a single one of the starters, or half of the starters, were not even playing in this game. And they posted a net rating of minus 7.6 in the 4 games that they actually did play together. And the starters with Isaac Okoro in place of Allen didn't really fare much better, with a net rating of minus 5.4. So Cleveland's starting unit was much better in 2023, but still they only managed to get a 3.2 postseason net rating. So that starting lineup that they have is just going to need to get better individually and, playing together better, as opposed to just acquiring better pieces, And depth matters much more in the regular season than it does in the postseason. So I feel like that's sort of like when you're asked how important when you're asked the importance of depth, you sort of have to think about the context. And hold on, let me just go ahead and look at. There's somebody in the chat, Anthony Manzano, and he says, with the NBA possibly adding and extending to other cities and they realign the divisions, what team in Texas would make in the East? That's a very, very good question, and one that I didn't really think about. I haven't really, I know the Dallas Cowboys, they are an NFC East team, but I don't really consider that, they're not in the East, I don't know why they're an NFC East team, but I digress. Now, honestly, like, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if if Dallas was to go to the Eastern Conference. Like, if there was any team that was to go to the Eastern Conference, it would probably be Dallas. And let me just hold on just 1 second. I just want to go ahead and see like where Houston is on Dallas. Not on Dallas, but on Texas, because honestly, I'm not very good at geography, but given the fact that the Dallas Cowboys are in the NFC East, I would put the Mavericks in the NFC East as well. Not in the NFC East, but in the Eastern Conference for the NBA. Now, if Google will actually like give me an image, okay, thank you. I mean, you could really like, it's either between Houston or Dallas, like, because Houston, you could argue, is much more like farther to the east than Dallas, but at the same time, like, I mean, it's like they're in the western side of they're in like sort of the western hemisphere, not in the western hemisphere, but in the western side of the United States. And oh, Mananzo also had more in the chat. Yeah, I am a Dolphins fan. I understand why we stayed in the AFC East, but geographically we would make more sense in the AFC South, and Indianapolis makes more sense in the East. Yeah, that is true. I do understand that take. I'm not really going to talk much about football because like that's just not what I'm supposed to do. We have other football podcasts, so if you are interested in speaking about football like towards the other podcasts, I recommend going and checking that out. There's TJ, he does the sports podcast like directly after I do my podcast. So if you want to tune into his thoughts, and he's going to be talking about the NFL game that happened recently. If you want to tune into his thoughts, then go right ahead and look at his and watch his live. He's going to go live at I believe at like 2:00. But yeah, I do understand what you're saying about like, you know, the AFC and the way that it's aligned. It's not really like, it seems a little weird, and a lot of the NFL alignments are weird. And another question from Mananzo, did I already preview the Southeastern Division? Yes, and the video is going to be uploaded later today after I finish with the live. So if you're interested in what I had to say, then you can go right ahead and click on the video, or you can rewind. I'm pretty sure you can do that if that was in the first segment if you're interested. So anyways, back to what I was saying. Depth is, it's like a yes and a no. You need depth in the regular season, but in the postseason, you need that star power. So it's all about finding a balance of both and how you're able to implement that into winning. And so you can't really get a definitive answer into like how important depth is to a team, right? It depends on the situation and the context. So depending on which team, depth might work for them, but another team, a different type of style might actually work for them. Like maybe, like, you know, I mentioned how the Celtics, every single time they've won the championship, they usually have great depth. But the Cavs, when they won their championship, they had the 1-2 punch of LeBron and Kyrie and everybody else that was there. So it is possible to win a championship with depth, and it's also possible to win a championship with star power. Let me rephrase that. It's possible to win the championship with a lot of depth, and it's also possible to win the championship with a lot of star power, because having depth alone isn't going to take you all the way to the finals, and having star power alone isn't going to take you all the way to the finals. We've seen James Harden have star power alone, didn't take him to the finals. We've seen Kobe have star power alone, didn't take him to the finals. We've seen the Atlanta Hawks in 2015, I believe. They had depth alone, and they got swept in the postseason by the Cavs. So, you know, just a little food for thought. Whenever you're thinking of a team and what they need, you always have to sort of find a right balance between the two. And Mananzo's in the chat again saying, I think Brunson is a star, but I don't think he's a superstar like most New York Knicks fans think he is. See, I disagree with that. I think he is a superstar. I genuinely think that the numbers that he puts up on the offensive side of the ball are superstar caliber numbers. Yes, his defense is a liability, but so is Donovan Mitchell's. And it's like he's got to be in that conversation. Like, what was that stretch that he went on in the postseason? 4 or 5 straight games of 40-plus points. That is superstar talent right there. I'm sorry, that is superstar talent. You cannot tell me that it's not. But I digress. So aside from that, we're done with this fourth segment. So I'm going to hit your questions right after this break. But I'm going to go into the fifth segment where I talk about a player who I feel didn't deserve to win an MVP. And spoiler alert, the year that we're on is 1965. So for any of you guys who know who won the MVP that year, then you know exactly who I'll be talking about. But for those of you who don't know, stay tuned, and I'll reveal that after this short break. And we are back with the fifth segment of the GSMC Basketball Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. And in this fifth segment, we are going to be talking about a player who I feel like doesn't deserve to win the MVP. We're on year 1965. But before I begin, I do want to acknowledge Anthony in the chat. He says he mentioned he commented about how I commented about James Harden, having too much star power on Houston and how that didn't work. He said the issue with Harden, as an example, he's such a ball hog that him doing that hurts the team and he disappears way too much in the playoffs. I disagree with the first statement claiming that he's a ball hog, because you can't say that he's a ball hog when he's averaging as many assists as he does. And I understand what you mean by saying he's a ball hog, where he likes, to hold the ball for 24 seconds at times and take a really ridiculous shot. But it worked back then, so I couldn't really complain about it. And again, the assist numbers that he averaged, they were very, very good. But I do agree with the second part of your sentence where you're saying that he disappears way too much in the postseason. And that, I think, is actually the real reason why they were unable to even win a title with James Harden. The fact that he just disappears. Because for starters, if Chris Paul didn't get injured in 2018, and if the Houston Rockets didn't miss 27 straight threes, and if Golden State didn't have such a ridiculous, overpowered lineup every single year, James Harden would probably be in the finals. He probably would have. I genuinely think that in 2018, that would have been the year that he would have won the finals. Now, I think LeBron would have put up a great fight, but that was definitely his best chance of winning the finals. And really, the reason why they weren't able to do that, they weren't able to get all the way and get there, was because of not only just the teams falling short, but primarily Harden falling short as well. And that's happened, every single season. I can go on a whole tangent about James Harden collapsing in the postseason, because it happens a lot, but let's not do that. Instead, let's talk about Bill Russell, who Anthony in the chat already knows was the MVP of 1965. And this man is going to be featured a lot on this list. And again, before I go on another rant, Menenzo's in the chat again saying, in general, I don't think those Houston teams had enough talent to match up with Golden State. You can't just rely on James Harden, and I'm starting to think it wasn't his fault that he disappeared. And I mean, yeah, I understand, you can't just rely on one player and one player only, but they were one game away from doing it. They could have done it. They were one game away, and then Chris Paul got hurt. anything, like the entire scope of the NBA landscape, that everything could have changed. Like, you have no idea. And the fact that they were just one game away shows that they had a legitimate shot. Like, they had a chance. And aside from that, I digress. Let's continue with the MVP debate. So, before I begin, I just want to say that we are entering the territory of Bill Russell. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that Bill Russell has won several MVPs of his entire career. And a lot of those MVPs weren't deserved. Why? Because players voted for the award during his career. Now, that is very, very important, because that way you guys will know exactly why Bill Russell was able to win the MVP over all of these players that I'm going to mention. Now, I'm only going to mention like this year in this example, and then the next time I do this segment, I'm going to bring up every single year where Bill Russell didn't deserve the MVP. Because the rules at the time stated, like the fact that, players were voting for the MVPs, the rules at the time were that players weren't allowed to vote for themselves or a teammate. So naturally, they would give the biggest name on the best team their votes. And yes, winning determines value, but you also have to think about and look at the stats and exactly what they're producing. So the players, they voted, and this happens 4 times in Bill Russell's career. 4 times in 5 years, Bill Russell wins an MVP over somebody that I feel and that a lot of people feel is more deserving of the award due to a difference in team record. Because MVP, obviously, I say this all the time, most valuable player, you have to generate wins. The Celtics back in this timeline were the most dominant team in the NBA. They were always winning. And it's like we joke about it all the time. Like, oh, they played against plumbers. They would always win. They would dominate every single team. And like the biggest reason why Bill Russell would win these MVPs is due to the difference in team record, because the Celtics were so good for so long. And Mananzo's in the chat saying, for me, based on the stats, the award should have gone to either Chamberlain or West, not Russell, but I can understand why they gave it to Russell because Austin won the championship that year. And I actually completely disagree with you on that statement with Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt Chamberlain did not deserve MVP this year. It was actually somebody else and like 2 other players that I think deserved the MVP over that. And Wilt is going to come up later. Like, don't worry, he's definitely going to come up later. But in this instance, like, he's definitely not gonna be a part on this list. Fern PG's in the chat. Hey Fern, how's it going? But no, Bill Russell, when he won his MVP in 1965, he averaged 14 points, 24 rebounds, and 5 assists on 44% shooting. Again, very good numbers. I'm not degrading the numbers. Like, those are great stats. However, the Big O, Oscar Robertson, he averaged 30, 9, and 12 on 48% shooting. And Jerry West was also another option for MVP, averaging 31, 6, and 5. So, like, their value and just their ability on the court and their ability to, like, play on the court and just the numbers that they've been able to produce. Now, there weren't, back in the day, there weren't as many stats that were tracked. It was just points, rebounds, and assists. So I can't really talk about, the steals and all that other stuff and all the other advanced stats. But Jerry West was leading the NBA in the advanced stats category with his 31, 6, and 5 averages. And so I really feel like if you were going to give anyone the MVP that year, it should have been either Oscar Robertson or Jerry West. And as I alluded to before on this previous podcast, right, this isn't the only MVP that Bill Russell has won where I feel like he didn't deserve to win the MVP. But if I were to talk about all of those, players that I think deserved MVP over him, we'd be here all day. So instead, what I'm actually going to do is for next week, I'm going to do a whole other segment where I just talk about specifically Bill Russell's MVPs, and like in every single year where he won the MVP, where I think he shouldn't have, where I think it should have gone to somebody else. So every year before 1965, when Bill Russell won the MVP, I'm going to talk about it, and I'm going to talk about the other players and the other who I feel deserve to win the MVP aside from Bill Russell. Because again, the biggest difference and the biggest reason why Bill Russell won the MVPs that he won was due to a difference in team record. Celtics were always the best, and the fact that players would vote for the MVP as opposed to anybody else. So, and before I end this off, Mananzo's in the chat saying, yeah, analytics wasn't really as prevalent back then, so we didn't know their defensive efficiency, offensive efficiency, or shooting percentage. And, obviously that makes conversations like this a little bit more difficult, but I mean, we know how good the Boston Celtics roster was. We know how loaded the team was. We know how good the team was. We know that Bill Russell was putting up these stats on a good team, a very, very good team. And these guys were putting up stats on much more mediocre teams. Now, obviously, team record is very important when you're looking at MVPs. But further down the line, as I go on with these players, you're going to see some ridiculous stat lines that feel like they deserve MVP, but they didn't win the MVP. And that's sort of where I think, the player voting came into effect. But aside from that, that's all I have for this podcast. And as I said before, the next time I do a segment like this, I'm going to be talking about all of Bill Russell's MVPs. So if you want to tune into that, then be sure to tune in. I'm probably going to do it Monday. I'm not entirely sure when I'm going to do it, but I might have it prepared for Monday. But aside from that, thank you for tuning into the GSMC Basketball Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It really does make a difference. We also invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram for more content and updates. As usual, please remember to use the link displayed in the description, and as usual, please remember to use Super Chat if you want to get your comment or question noticed during the show. We love hearing from you guys, whether you guys have a hot take, something you've been dying to share, something you've been wanting to say. We're all ears. You can use Super Chat, and you can send in your donations that way, and you can send in your chats that way. If you really want your chat to get featured on the show, then you can send in Super Chat, and it will definitely get featured next time on the show. And if Super Chat isn't really your thing, then you can always use the link in the description, gsmcpodcast.net, and send in your tips and donations that way, or your comments that way. Really helps the show, makes it much more interactive between myself and you guys. That's all I have for you today on this final segment. Thank you so much for tuning in. I am your host, Nelson. Have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy football, because it's the first week of football that we get. First full weekend of football we're going to get, ladies and gentlemen. So enjoy that. And as always, take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great.